Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Today channel. Steffy unexpectedly returns to LA, stopping Ridge and Brooke's wedding. Taylor must prevent toxic Brooke from winning. While Taylor Hayes resisted allowing toxic Brooke Logan to triumph, Luna Nozawa emailed Will Spencer a picture of herself wearing a mask. Thomas Forrester forced Brooke to acknowledge that she had lost Ridge Forrester and that Taylor had won this time around for good at Forrester Creations during Monday's B&B episode. Thomas maintained that Taylor was the lady Ridge proposed to, despite Brooke's protests on what transpired in Italy. Naturally, Brooke corrected Thomas on that point because it was Taylor, not Ridge, who proposed. Nevertheless, Thomas refused to allow Brooke to take away their family's remaining time together and was determined that his parents would get married. Taylor, meantime, became enraged over Brooke and Eric Forrester entering Ridge's thoughts after realizing that he was ending relationships because of Brooke. Taylor reaffirmed her refusal to allow Ridge to end their engagement, claiming that toxic Brooke would simply disappoint him once more. Will spoke with Katie Logan in the Forrester design office about how hard it was to keep the mystery woman a secret from Elector Forrester. Katie saw that he didn't want her to be upset and offered that perhaps he could get past the incident. She could see Luna was daydreaming about Will once more at Lee Finnegan's house, which essentially made her quit wishing for something she would never have. Luna didn't tell Lee anything more, but she was oddly hopeful that she would still have a shot with Will. Luna secretly had different ambitions of being a Spencer and never having to work, even though Lee intended for her to have 2 jobs and move on from her troubled upbringing. When Luna was by herself, she handled a pregnancy test box with a cheeky smirk before sending Will a picture of the mask she had on that evening. The sentence that indicated it would be their secret made Will seem uneasy. Stay tuned for updates, as well as those from others in Los Angeles, as Luna's survival will cause a stir as it spreads. Thomas unpacks, brings mysterious baggage home? Thomas Forrester's world implodes. The reminder of Forrester's troubled history in Brave and the Beautiful was excellent. Katie Logan and Brooke Logan talked about his terrible performance in previous years. Since there will be more of it in the future, B&B style, that typically indicates we are receiving a refresher course on his capabilities. Ridge Forrester expressed his concern about Thomas's attitude last week. Even Eric Forrester noticed that his grandchild didn't appear to be very content. Thus, B&B set the stage for what we could anticipate from Thomas, who isn't the cheerful man who moved out of Los Angeles months ago. Thomas was obsessed with Taylor Hayes' contentment. Thomas's initial course of action was to caution his father about the importance of sticking to his plan to wed Taylor Hayes. Last week on Bold and the Beautiful, he threw caution to the wind. Thomas gave the impression that Ridge's marriage to Taylor, which we now know isn't happening, was the key to his family's happiness. Indeed, Eric Forrester was right when he said that Thomas was an adult and should not be allowed to tell his father who he should marry. However, given that he firmly advises Ridge to break up with Taylor and return to Brooke, that was a bit hypocritical of the Forrester patriarch. Then, to tell Brooke to keep her hands off Ridge, Thomas cornered her. Brooke's sister Katie was within earshot of his firm warning. Katie worries about how far Thomas will go to see Ridge and Taylor get married, which makes his past a burden on her mind. She is therefore concerned about Brooke's security. Come something wicked this way? Thomas Forrester decided to return home to Los Angeles since something went horribly wrong in his life. And that's still a mystery. Although he was concerned that Taylor's heart would be broken, his homecoming probably involves more than what he has revealed thus far. Thomas mentioned a few negative aspects of his life in passing. He also broke off his engagement to Paris Buckingham. Additionally, he feels like a ship without a port in the apparel design industry. Despite not having a line of his own, he is an excellent designer. He seems to be feeling particularly sorry for himself today, based on the information provided. The fact that his son Douglas Forrester did not accompany him back is even more peculiar. Thomas seemed to have brought some terrible baggage with him when he returned home. Thus, Thomas's homecoming in Bold and the Beautiful most likely has a crazy backstory. And that narrative is probably just waiting to be published. The floodgates will probably open after Thomas learns that Ridge told Taylor he couldn't marry her. Brooke may be in risk, depending on how far Bold and the Beautiful chooses to go after Thomas in light of this information. It appears that B&B may soon have another insane individual on the loose in Los Angeles based on what we saw last week and a sneak peek at this week's promo. After that, the Logan and Forrester families struggle with brewing. As the CBS soap opera premieres this week, the Logans probably have Thomas Forrester to worry about while the Forresters get Luna Nozawa. Ridge Forrester, the epitome of brooding elegance in his tailored tuxedo, stood before the flower-adorned archway, his gaze fixed not on the officiant, but on the end of the aisle where his destiny, as he so often called her, would momentarily appear. Brooke Logan, radiant in a gown of exquisite ivory lace that whispered of timeless romance rather than virginal innocence, prepared to take that final walk, her heart a symphony of triumph and profound, hard-won love. This was it. After decades of scheming, hoping, loving, losing, and fighting, through Deacons and Dannies, through Taylors and whirlwinds in Aspen, the log was finally, irrevocably, going to be placed in the fireplace. The gathered crowd, a who's who of Los Angeles high society and the deeply entangled Forrester-Logan-Spencer clan, held a collective breath, their smiles genuine, albeit tinged with the weary relief of those who had endured this particular saga since the Reagan administration. Yet, beneath the surface of this picture-perfect moment, a tectonic shift was rushing toward them, unknown to all but the universe itself, which had always seemed to take a perverse delight in interrupting Ridge Forrester's weddings. Just as the first chord of the wedding march swelled, a sound far more primal and urgent cut through it, not a sound of celebration, but of desperation, the frantic skid of tires on the pristine driveway outside, the slam of a car door that echoed like a gunshot in the hushed anticipation. All heads, including Ridge's and a suddenly anxious Brooke's, turned toward the grand entrance, the unspoken question hanging in the air, who would dare? And then she was there. Steffy Forrester, a force of nature contained within a form of leather and palpable anguish, burst through the doors. She was not the sleek, corporate heir or the doting mother they were used to seeing. This was Steffy raw and unraveled, her hair windswept, her eyes wide with a terrifying cocktail of fear, love, and fierce determination. The journey from her self-imposed exile was written in the dust on her boots and the frantic beat of her heart, visible in the pulse at her throat. She didn't walk down the aisle, she stormed it, her boots clicking a staccato rhythm of impending doom on the marble floor, her gaze laser-focused on her father, effectively blocking Brooke's path and shattering the ceremony's sanctity. Stop. The word wasn't a request, it was a command, torn from the depths of her soul, raw and ragged. It hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. You can't do this, Dad. You have to stop. Ridge's face, a moment ago soft with adoration, hardened into a mask of confusion and defensive irritation. Steffy? What is the meaning of this? This is not the time, it's the only time, she interrupted, her voice breaking but losing none of its power. There won't be another chance to say this. To stop you from making the biggest mistake of your life. Again. Brooke found her voice, a tremulous weapon of wounded pride. Steffy, whatever this is about, it can wait. This is our wedding day. How could you be so selfish? Steffy turned her fiery gaze to Brooke, and in that look was the condensed history of their battle, the maternal rivalry, the competing claims to Ridge's soul, the endless cycle of betrayal and forgiveness. This isn't about being selfish, Brooke. This is about saving him. Saving you both from yourselves. She stepped closer to Ridge, her hands gripping his arms, not in congratulation, but in an urgent plea. Dad, listen to me. I had a dream, no, a nightmare. It was so real. It was Mom. Taylor. The name, spoken in that context, sent a visible shockwave through the room. Ridge flinched. She was in trouble, real trouble. It was dark, and she was calling for you. Not for help, but, for you. Because you weren't there. And the feeling of utter wrongness when you said I do in my dream, it was so profound it woke me up. I knew it was a sign. Brooke let out a derisive, though shaky, laugh. A dream? You're interrupting our wedding because of a bad dream? Steffy, that's absurd. You need to leave. now. But Ridge was listening. The superstitious, romantic, deeply impressionable part of him that had ping-ponged between these two women for his entire adult life was snared by the conviction in his daughter's eyes. "Taylor, is she okay? Have you heard from her? I tried calling, texting. Nothing. It's not like her, Dad, you know it's not. Something is wrong. And this," she gestured wildly at the wedding setup, "this feels so wrong it's making my skin crawl. This isn't peace. This is you settling for what's easy because you're tired of fighting. But love isn't supposed to be this hard, this destructive, over and over again. Look at your history. Look at the trail of broken hearts and broken families every time you two decide to follow your destiny. Your destiny isn't a person, Dad, it's a cycle of pain, and I am begging you, as your daughter who loves you more than anything, to break it. Don't do this. Not like this. Not when there's a doubt, however small, placed in our hearts for a reason." Her words were arrows, each one finding its mark not in malice, but in terrifying truth. Ridge looked from Steffy's desperate, tear-streaked face to Brooke's, which was now a mask of betrayed devastation. He saw the 30 years of history Steffy spoke of, the manipulations, the betrayals, the public humiliations, the times he had left Brooke, the times he had returned. He thought of Taylor, his other great love, the steady, grounding force he had so often taken for granted, who was now mysteriously silent, perhaps in danger, perhaps calling for him in some way he couldn't comprehend. The absolute certainty he had felt minutes before crumbled into dust. This wasn't just his daughter causing a scene, this was his child, who knew him better than almost anyone, intervening to save him from himself with a primal, intuitive warning he could not ignore. The wedding was more than stopped, it was annihilated. The spectacle was not just one of interruption, but of brutal, heartbreaking revelation. Steffy, in her furious, love-driven act, hadn't just postponed a ceremony, she had held up a mirror to the toxic cycle that was Ridge and Brooke's love story, and in that reflection, Ridge finally saw the pattern for what it was, not destiny, but addiction. The room remained in stunned silence, a frozen tableau of shattered expectations, as Ridge's shoulders slumped in surrender not to his daughter, but to the profound and unsettling truth she had delivered. The wedding was over. Taylor and Brooke was never a fair fight, not in the conventional sense of rivalries over grades or affection or social standing. It was a silent, seeping war of attrition waged in the cold, sterile hallways of their high school and the curated, venomous grids of social media, a conflict where the primary casualty was Taylor's very sense of self, a quiet erosion orchestrated not with shouts but with whispers, not with shoves but with devastating, calculated exclusion, a campaign so insidious that Taylor often found herself questioning the very reality Brooke so skillfully manipulated, wondering if the problem was, in fact, her own perception, her own sensitivity, her own inability to just take a joke or let things go, which was, of course, Brooke's most potent weapon, the gaslighting that made toxicity feel like normality and resistance feel like paranoia. Brooke didn't win with a triumphant, public victory, she won in the quiet moments, in the way Taylor's stomach would clench seeing a notification with her name, in the way she'd instinctively scan a room to locate Brooke upon entering, a prey animal forever aware of its predator, in the way a perfectly good day could be atomized by a single, sly comment from Brooke about Taylor's clothes, or her friends, or a project she'd worked on with desperate care, a comment delivered with a saccharine smile that left Taylor disarmed and bleeding internally while everyone else saw only pleasantry. This was why Taylor couldn't let her win, not for pride, not for vengeance, but for survival, for the fundamental, non-negotiable right to exist in her own skin without preemptive apology, to reclaim the mental real estate that Brooke occupied rent-free, to silence the internal monologue that had been hijacked and rewritten in Brooke's condescending tone, a voice that now lived inside her own head, critiquing her choices, second-guessing her worth, and constantly anticipating the next blow. Letting Brooke win would mean accepting that version of reality, it would mean capitulating to the idea that she was, as Brooke so subtly implied, too much and yet not enough, too loud yet too quiet, too ambitious yet not talented enough, too emotional yet somehow also cold, a walking contradiction whose only defining trait was her ability to be defined by Brooke's whims. To let Brooke win would be to grant permanent residency to that corrosive doubt, to allow the toxic narrative to become the official record of her adolescence, a story where she was the awkward, difficult footnote to Brooke's gleaming narrative of popularity and ease. The victory Taylor sought wasn't about humiliating Brooke or orchestrating her social downfall. That would be to play by Brooke's own rules, to become a mirror image of the very poison she was fighting, and Taylor knew, deep in her bones, that winning by becoming toxic herself was the ultimate, most grotesque form of losing. No, the victory was far more personal, far more profound. It was the victory of indifference, the monumental achievement of hearing Brooke's laugh across the cafeteria and feeling nothing but the mild recognition of a sound. It was the ability to post a picture without running a complex algorithm of how Brooke might weaponize it. It was the liberation of spending an entire weekend without once mentally rehearsing a conversation with her. It was the reclamation of autonomy, the defiant, quiet act of living a life that was no longer a reaction to Brooke's presence but a proclamation of her own. This was a war fought in the trenches of the mind, and every time Taylor chose not to dissect a cryptic text, every time she laughed genuinely with a friend without casting a wary eye to see if Brooke was watching to steal her joy, every time she wore an outfit she loved without preemptively armoring herself against a backhanded compliment, she was scoring a point on a scoreboard only she could see. She couldn't let Brooke win because the prize was her own soul, the vibrant, curious, and kind person she was before Brooke decided to try and edit her into something smaller, paler, quieter. That person was worth fighting for, not with Brooke's weapons of mass manipulation, but with the quiet, relentless artillery of self-respect, by building a life so full of genuine connection, personal achievement, and unperformative happiness that Brooke's opinions simply could not find a foothold. They would slide off the glossy, fortified surface of a well-lived life like rain off a waxed car. Taylor's victory would be invisible to the world. There would no crowning moment, no trophy, no public admission of defeat from Brooke, who would likely never even acknowledge the battle existed, would likely simply move on to a new source of narcissistic supply when Taylor ceased to provide the reaction she craved. But Taylor would know. She would feel it in the lightness of her step, in the calm rhythm of her heart when she passes Brooke in the hall, in the expansive freedom of a mind no longer cluttered with defensive strategies. She would know she had won when the story of her life ceased to be a tense drama starring Brooke as the antagonist and became instead a sprawling, complex narrative of her own making, with Brooke reduced to a minor, bitter character in the prologue, a footnote of a lesson learned about the resilience of the human spirit. To let Brooke win would be to live the rest of her life with a ghost, haunted by the version of herself she allowed to be diminished. To not let her win is to exorcise that ghost every single day through 1,000 small acts of courage. The courage to be kind in a world that rewarded Brooke's cruelty, the courage to be vulnerable when Brooke's armor was spite, the courage to believe in her own reality despite a constant campaign to gaslight her into doubt. This is why Taylor can't let toxic Brooke win, because the cost is a perpetual winter of the self, and Taylor, she has finally decided, is destined for a spring all her own, a season of growth that Brooke's shadow will no longer be long enough to eclipse. The battle is internal, the victory is peace, and the prize, finally, is herself. Thomas alighted onto the platform of a home that no longer felt entirely his own. The air here was different, not better or worse than the air of the place he had left, but thicker, heavy with the unspoken histories of his youth and the quiet judgment of familiar things. He had been away for a season that felt like a geological age, and in that time, something fundamental within him had been subjected to a pressure so immense it had recrystallized his very being. He had left as sandstone and returned, if not as diamond, then as something harder, colder, and infinitely more fragile. The journey back had been a silent, tremulous affair, a reverse migration guided by an internal compass whose needle now spun wildly, torn between the poles of duty and desire, memory and amnesia. And it was this internal schism that was made manifest in the single, starkly anomalous object he carried, not a suitcase, not a satchel, but a large, oblong case of worn, supple leather the color of a day-old bruise, held fast by brass clasps that gleamed with a sly, secretive light. It was this baggage, this mysterious and uninvited companion on his return, that marked the difference between the Thomas who had departed and the Thomas who now stood, hesitant, on the cracked concrete of his past life. The case was not large enough to contain a body, Yet it seemed to possess a gravitational mass far exceeding its physical dimensions, a weight that pulled not just on his arm but on the very atmosphere around him, warping the casual greetings of old neighbors into curious, sidelong glances, making the cheerful shout of a name from across the street seem to die in the air before it could reach him. He carried it with a peculiar combination of reverence and revulsion, his grip tight as if fearing it might spring open of its own volition, yet his arm held it away from his body, maintaining a careful distance from the thing it contained, or perhaps protecting his body from it. He walked the well-trodden path from the station to his childhood home, a route his feet could navigate in the deepest sleep, yet every hedge, every garden gate, every uneven paving slab